History does not begin with a nation, a border, or a name. It begins with space. Long before the word Germany existed, the land at the center of Europe was simply terrain, forests stretching without paths, rivers flowing without titles, and climates shifting slowly over generations. This region was not defined by politics or identity, but by movement, survival, and time. More than 40,000 years ago, small groups of humans passed through this landscape. They were not settlers in the modern sense. They followed animals, seasons, and water, carrying little and leaving even less behind. Yet traces remained: stone tools, fire marks, fragments of bone. In caves and sheltered valleys, evidence shows that these early people shaped their environment carefully, responding to its limits rather than attempting to control it. Life moved at the pace of daylight and weather. Among the most significant remnants of this distant past are objects found in what is now southern Germany. Carved figures made from ivory, delicate in form and abstract in meaning, suggest symbolic thought. Simple musical instruments, shaped from bone, indicate rhythm and sound as part of early human life. These objects do not tell stories of power or conquest. They suggest continuity, creativity, and a quiet relationship between people and their surroundings. For thousands of years, this pattern continued. Human presence was temporary, flexible, and responsive. Then, gradually, a change occurred. Around the 6th millennium BCE, new practices arrived in Central Europe. Farming and animal domestication altered the rhythm of life. Groups began to remain in one place, cultivating crops and raising livestock. Permanent settlements emerged along rivers and fertile plains. The land was no longer only crossed, it was worked. This transition, often called the Neolithic Revolution, was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, unevenly, and differently across regions. Some communities adopted agriculture fully. Others combined it with hunting and gathering for generations. With permanent settlement came new social structures. Houses clustered together. Tools became specialized. Pottery appeared, decorated with repeating patterns that reflected shared customs rather than individual expression. Agriculture reshaped the landscape itself. Forests were cleared, fields expanded, and paths formed between villages. Over time, the land began to carry marks of long-term human presence. Storage pits, boundary lines, and burial sites suggest growing concern with ownership, memory, and continuity. Life was still fragile, dependent on weather and harvests, but it had become rooted. As centuries passed, technological knowledge increased. During the Bronze Age, metalworking introduced new tools and objects of value. Weapons, ornaments, and ceremonial items appeared in graves, indicating differences in status and emerging hierarchies. Trade networks extended far beyond local regions. Amber, copper, and tin moved across long distances, connecting Central Europe to the Mediterranean world and beyond. One remarkable object from this era is a bronze disc decorated with symbols of the sky. It reflects an understanding of celestial cycles and suggests that time itself had become something to observe and interpret. Such artifacts point not to isolated innovation, but to shared systems of knowledge passed across communities. The Iron Age brought further change. Metal tools became stronger and more widely available. Settlements grew larger and more complex. In southern regions, groups later identified as Celts developed fortified hilltop centers and expansive trade connections. In the north and east, other communities lived in smaller, less centralized groups. Ancient writers would later refer to them collectively as Germanic, though this term did not reflect a shared identity. These communities did not see themselves as part of a single people. They spoke different dialects, followed local customs, and organized life around kinship rather than centralized authority. There were no unified borders, no shared political structures, and no collective name that bound them together. Identity was local, shaped by landscape and tradition, rather than abstract belonging. By this point, the land that would later be called Germany was already deeply shaped by human activity. Fields had replaced forests in some regions. Trade routes crossed river valleys. Cultural patterns had formed, dissolved, and reformed over thousands of years. Yet there was still no state, no nation, and no idea of unity. What existed instead was continuity, a space of transition between north and south, east and west, a region where movement was constant and influence flowed in multiple directions. Long before written history began to describe it, Central Europe had already become a place of exchange, adaptation, and gradual transformation. This early period left no chronicles and named no rulers. Its legacy lies in patterns rather than events. It formed the quiet foundation upon which later structures would rise, not as a beginning of a country, but as the long, patient shaping of a landscape by human presence. The story continues not with conquest, but with proximity. As the Roman world expanded northward, it approached a landscape already shaped by centuries of human life. Rivers became reference points, not borders in the modern sense, but lines of orientation. To the Romans, the lands beyond the Rhine and the Danube were close enough to observe, trade with, and influence, yet distant enough to remain uncertain. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had established itself as the dominant power of the Mediterranean world. Its armies, administrators, and merchants moved steadily outward, bringing with them roads, laws, and systems of order. When Roman forces reached the great rivers of Central Europe, they encountered societies unlike those within the empire. These communities did not build cities of stone or maintain written laws. They organized themselves around kinship, seasonal rhythms, and local authority. Roman writers grouped these diverse societies under a single name, Germanic. It was not a term of self-identification, but a label applied from the outside. The people it described shared no unified language, no common political structure, and no collective identity. They lived in small settlements, practiced mixed agriculture, and relied on oral tradition rather than written record. Leadership was temporary and personal, shaped by reputation rather than institutional power. Rome did not immediately seek to absorb these lands fully. Instead, it defined a boundary. Along the Rhine and the Danube, a frontier system emerged. Forts, watchtowers, roads, and walls formed what later became known as the limes. This was not a single wall, but a flexible zone of control. Soldiers monitored movement, merchants crossed legally, and diplomats negotiated alliances. The frontier was porous, active, and constantly maintained. South of this line, Roman life took root. Towns developed with baths, temples, and marketplaces. Roman law regulated trade and property. Latin was spoken in administration and commerce. Coins circulated widely, standardizing value and exchange. Infrastructure, connected settlements across long distances, binding the region to the broader imperial system. North of the frontier, life followed a different pattern. Settlements remained smaller and more dispersed. Power was local, and social bonds were reinforced through custom and memory rather than written authority. Yet the frontier did not divide two isolated worlds. Contact was constant. Goods moved across the border. Roman pottery, weapons, and jewelry appear in non-Roman contexts, while raw materials from the north entered imperial markets. Some individuals crossed the boundary permanently. Germanic warriors served as auxiliaries in the Roman army, gaining experience, wealth, and status. In return, Rome gained manpower and local knowledge. Others settled within the empire, integrating into Roman towns while maintaining elements of their own traditions. The frontier thus became a place of exchange rather than exclusion. This long period of contact reshaped both sides. Roman administrators adapted their strategies, learning when force was effective and when negotiation was preferable. Germanic leaders observed Roman organization and prestige, adopting symbols of authority that reflected imperial influence. Yet, cultural difference remained. Roman society relied on centralized control and written law. Germanic communities valued personal loyalty and customary practice. The balance was fragile. Attempts to extend Roman rule beyond the frontier met resistance. One such effort ended in disaster when Roman legions were destroyed in forested terrain they could not control. After this loss, Rome adjusted its ambitions. The frontier was reinforced, not pushed forward. Stability replaced expansion. For centuries, this arrangement endured. The empire held its line. The communities beyond it continued their lives, shaped by internal dynamics and external contact. Neither side fully absorbed the other. Instead, a long coexistence developed, marked by tension, adaptation, and gradual influence. By the 3rd century CE, pressures began to mount. Economic strain, political instability, and external threats weakened Rome's ability to maintain its borders. Raids increased, and the frontier became harder to defend. Yet even as control faltered, Roman presence left a lasting imprint. Roads remained. Cities endured. Administrative habits influenced emerging forms of authority. This period was not defined by a single clash, but by centuries of observation and interaction. It created a shared space where difference was constant and boundaries were negotiated daily. The encounter between Rome and the Germanic world did not produce immediate transformation. It laid foundations quietly, through contact rather than conquest, shaping the conditions from which new orders would later emerge. The transition did not arrive as a single moment of collapse. It unfolded gradually, unevenly, and often without clear direction. During the late 4th century, the balance that had long defined the Roman world began to shift. Structures that once seemed permanent grew fragile, not because they vanished overnight, but because they could no longer adapt to the pressures surrounding them. Across Europe, movement increased. Groups that had lived for generations within familiar regions began to travel farther, sometimes slowly, sometimes abruptly. These movements were later described collectively as the migration period, though they did not form a single wave or follow a single cause. Climate variation, population pressure, internal conflicts, and the arrival of new peoples from the East all contributed. Migration was not always invasion. Often it was relocation, negotiation, or gradual settlement. For Rome, this movement posed a challenge. The empire had long relied on stable borders and predictable relationships with neighboring societies. As more groups approached or crossed imperial frontiers, those systems were strained. Some were admitted as allies or settlers, given land in exchange for military service. Others entered without permission, driven by necessity rather than ambition. The distinction between inside and outside became increasingly blurred. Within the empire, internal weakness compounded the problem. Economic resources were unevenly distributed. Tax systems faltered. Political authority shifted frequently, with emperors rising and falling in rapid succession. Armies remained powerful, but loyalty was often tied to commanders rather than institutions. In the western provinces, distance from the imperial center made coordination difficult. Responses were delayed, inconsistent, and sometimes absent. As Roman control weakened, local solutions emerged. Cities fortified themselves. Landowners formed private defenses. Administrative roles once filled by imperial officials were taken over by local elites. Roman law and custom did not disappear, but they were applied selectively, adapted to circumstance, rather than enforced uniformly. Authority became fragmented, shared among those who could maintain order in limited spaces. Meanwhile, migrating groups established new patterns of rule. Some formed kingdoms within former Roman territory, blending inherited Roman structures with their own traditions. Leadership was personal and flexible, based on loyalty and success rather than fixed bureaucracy. These new rulers often sought legitimacy through continuity, adopting Roman titles, laws, and symbols to stabilize their authority. The event traditionally used to mark the end of Western Roman rule occurred in 476 CE, when the last emperor in the West was removed from office. This act was symbolic rather than transformative. By that point, imperial power had already receded. The Eastern Empire continued to function, preserving Roman administration and culture for centuries. The West, however, entered a period of reorganization rather than collapse. In the regions north of the former imperial core, including much of Central Europe, this reorganization created new balances of power. No single authority replaced Rome. Instead, a mosaic of territories emerged, each governed by its own customs and leadership. Some retained strong Roman influence. Others developed more independently. The shared feature was adaptability. Christian institutions gained prominence during this period. As imperial structures faded, churches and monasteries provided continuity. Bishops assumed roles that combined spiritual guidance with social leadership. Written tradition, education, and record-keeping increasingly rested in religious hands. The church did not replace the empire, but it offered stability in a time of uncertainty. This era was once described as an age of decline. Modern understanding views it differently. It was a period of transformation, marked by loss and creation alike. Old systems dissolved, but new forms of organization took shape. The Roman world did not vanish. It was redistributed, reshaped through contact with societies that had long existed alongside it. By the end of this transition, Europe no longer revolved around a single center. Power was local, identities were fluid, and authority was negotiated rather than imposed. The fall of Rome was not an ending in isolation. It was part of a wider process in which movement, adaptation, and survival redefined the landscape of the continent. From this shifting ground, new political and cultural formations would emerge, grounded not in imperial unity, but in regional continuity and gradual change. After the disappearance of Roman authority in the West, power did not fall into emptiness. Instead, it settled unevenly into the hands of new leaders who operated within the remains of the old world. Roads still connected regions, cities still stood, and Roman customs continued to shape daily life. What changed was the source of authority. In this shifting landscape, the Frankish realm began to take form. The Franks were not a unified people at first. They consisted of several related groups living along the Rhine, long familiar with Roman presence. Some had served in Roman armies, others had traded across imperial borders. When centralized rule weakened, these relationships became pathways to influence. Frankish leaders moved into positions once held by Roman officials, not by destroying existing structures, but by inhabiting them. Leadership in the early Frankish world was personal rather than institutional. Authority depended on loyalty, reputation, and the ability to reward followers. Over time, this personal rule evolved into kingship. One ruler in particular succeeded in consolidating Frankish power across a wide territory and redefining its direction. Clovis Apertor, ruling at the turn of the 6th century, transformed a loose collection of groups into a durable political order. Clovis's significance did not lie only in military success. His most decisive act was religious. By adopting Catholic Christianity rather than alternative Christian traditions common among other Germanic rulers, he aligned himself with the established church of the former Roman world. This decision connected Frankish authority to a powerful institutional network that survived the empire itself. It also granted Clovis legitimacy among Roman elites and clergy, who now saw Frankish rule as continuity rather than rupture. Christianization during this period was gradual and uneven. It did not spread through mass conversion or sudden change. Instead, it advanced through personal example, political alliance, and the steady work of missionaries. Churches were built where older sacred spaces had stood. Rituals were adapted rather than erased. For many communities, belief shifted slowly, often across generations. Missionaries played a central role in this process. Traveling across forests, river valleys, and rural settlements, they established monasteries that became anchors of stability. These institutions were not only religious centers, they preserved written knowledge, organized agriculture, and served as hubs of education. In a world with limited administration, monasteries offered continuity and memory. The Frankish realm expanded through a combination of conquest, negotiation, and inheritance. As new territories were absorbed, older customs were often preserved under new leadership. Law codes were written down, blending Roman legal traditions with Frankish practice. Justice remained local, but it was increasingly framed within shared principles. Christianity provided a common language across regional difference. This early medieval order did not resemble a centralized state. Communication was slow, governance fragmented, and authority constantly negotiated. Kings relied on nobles, nobles on local leaders, and all depended on land and labor. The church acted as a stabilizing force within this system, linking local communities to a broader spiritual structure that extended beyond any single ruler. Time itself began to be understood differently. Christian calendars replaced older seasonal markers. history was recorded in relation to sacred events rather than ancestral memory alone. This shift reshaped how people understood their place in the world. Life became part of a larger narrative that extended beyond local tradition. The Frankish realm did not create a nation. It created a framework. Within it, diverse populations lived under shared assumptions about authority, belief, and order. Identity remained regional, but allegiance increasingly pointed upward, toward kingship sanctioned by faith. By the early Middle Ages, Central Europe had moved beyond the immediate aftermath of Rome. A new structure had emerged, built on adaptation rather than replacement. The alliance between Frankish power and Christianity established patterns that would shape political and cultural life for centuries, not through sudden transformation, but through slow and enduring change. The rise of a larger order did not begin with a sudden declaration of empire. It began with consolidation. By the late 8th century, the Frankish realm had grown extensive, yet it remained uneven in practice. Authority depended on personal ties, local custom, and regional balance. Into this setting stepped a ruler whose reign would reshape how power, belief, and knowledge were organized across much of Western and Central Europe. Charlemagne inherited a kingdom already strengthened by alliance with the church and expanded through military success. What distinguished his rule was not only expansion, but structure. He sought to bind diverse regions into a coherent whole, not by erasing difference, but by layering authority above it. This authority was framed as both political and religious, grounded in the idea that order itself carried moral purpose. The concept of empire under Charlemagne was not a revival of Rome in form, but in aspiration. It drew on Roman memory, Christian legitimacy, and Frankish practice. Governance relied on movement rather than fixed administration. The ruler traveled constantly, holding court in different regions, issuing judgments, confirming rights, and reinforcing loyalty. Power was visible, personal, and repeated through presence. Administration followed a similar logic. The realm was divided into local units governed by appointed officials who acted in the ruler's name. Their task was not to replace local custom, but to oversee it. To maintain consistency, royal envoys were sent on regular circuits, inspecting courts, hearing complaints, and ensuring that decisions aligned with central expectations. This system did not eliminate fragmentation, but it reduced isolation. Religion played a central role in this process. Christianity was no longer only a shared belief. It became an organizing principle. Churches and monasteries multiplied, supported by royal patronage. Bishops and abbots acted as administrators as much as spiritual leaders. Through them, royal authority reached into communities that had little direct contact with the court. Faith provided unity where bureaucracy could not. Education was another pillar of this emerging order. Charlemagne viewed learning not as ornament, but as necessity. To govern effectively, he required literate clergy and officials capable of reading, writing, and calculation. Schools were established at courts and monasteries. Texts were collected, copied, and standardized. This effort did not aim at widespread literacy, but at reliability. Knowledge was to be preserved, clarified, and transmitted without distortion. The result was a quiet intellectual renewal. Ancient works were studied alongside Christian texts. Language was refined for clarity. A standardized script improved legibility and consistency across regions. These changes affected administration, law, and worship alike. They reduced misunderstanding and created a shared cultural reference that extended beyond local dialect and custom. Charlemagne's authority reached its symbolic height when he was recognized as emperor. This act did not create a new system overnight, but it confirmed an idea already in motion. The ruler was no longer only king of a people, but guardian of a broader order. The title carried expectations of protection, justice, and religious responsibility. It also implied continuity with a past that had never fully disappeared. Yet the empire remained dependent on the individual at its center. There was no permanent capital, no independent bureaucracy, no fixed line of succession guaranteed by law alone. Loyalty was renewed through ritual, oath, and presence. Stability required constant reinforcement. The empire functioned because it was actively maintained. Despite these limits, the effects of this reign were lasting. Administrative habits endured. Educational reforms shaped future institutions. The close alignment of political authority and religious structure became a defining feature of medieval governance. Even after the realm fragmented, its organizing principles remained influential. Charlemagne did not create a modern state, nor did he impose uniformity. What he established was a model, an empire held together by shared belief, managed through delegated authority, and supported by controlled knowledge. This model would be adapted, contested, and reshaped in the centuries that followed. But its foundations were laid during this period of deliberate consolidation and quiet ambition. The strength of an empire often depends on the figure at its center. When that figure disappears, the structure is tested. After Charlemagne's death, the realm he had shaped did not collapse at once, but it began to change in character. The systems he had maintained through personal authority and constant movement were difficult to sustain without the same presence. What followed was not immediate disorder, but a gradual rebalancing of power. Charlemagne was succeeded by his son, who inherited both the title and the responsibility of holding together a vast and diverse realm. He sought continuity, preserving the alliance with the Church and maintaining the administrative practices established earlier. Yet, the pressures were greater. Regional elites asserted their interests more openly, and the scale of the empire made unified control increasingly fragile. Governance required compromise rather than command. The greatest challenge emerged with the next generation. As was customary, the realm was divided among heirs. This division was not intended as fragmentation, but as shared rule within a single imperial framework. In practice, it altered the balance permanently. Authority became territorial rather than overarching. Loyalty shifted toward regional rulers who exercised power more directly. The formal division of the empire created three major realms. Each followed its own path, shaped by geography, culture, and political circumstance. The western portion developed toward what would later become France. The central territory, stretching from the North Sea to Italy, proved unstable and gradually dissolved into smaller units. The eastern realm, known as the East Frankish Kingdom, formed the foundation of a distinct political space. This eastern kingdom was not a nation. It was a collection of regions with strong local identities. Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, and Franconia retained their customs and leadership. The king's authority depended on cooperation with regional dukes rather than direct control. Power was negotiated through assemblies' oaths and mutual obligation. Yet within this loose structure, a shared orientation began to form. Language played a role in this shift. While Latin remained the language of the church and administration, spoken forms diverged regionally. In the Eastern realm, dialects distinct from those in the West became more prominent. Over time, these differences contributed to a sense of separation, not yet political, but cultural. People began to recognize themselves in relation to place rather than empire. The church remained a stabilizing force during this transition. Bishops and abbots preserved continuity across divisions. Monasteries continued to educate, record, and administer. Christian belief provided a common framework that transcended political boundaries, even as secular authority became more localized. Religious unity softened the effects of political division. Security concerns also shaped the emerging order. External pressures from neighboring groups required coordinated response. Kings of the Eastern realm relied on regional leaders to provide defense, reinforcing the importance of local power. In return, these leaders gained recognition and autonomy. The balance between center and periphery shifted, favoring regional authority within a shared framework. This period did not produce a clear identity in modern terms. There was no collective national consciousness, no unified legal system, and no fixed borders. What emerged instead was a habit of association. The Eastern realm functioned as a political space defined by cooperation among regions, shaped by shared heritage and common challenges. Charlemagne's legacy, therefore, was not a single enduring empire, but a set of practices and expectations. His emphasis on Christian legitimacy, delegated authority, and structured governance influenced how power was exercised even after unity faded. The idea that rule required moral grounding, administrative order, and cultural cohesion persisted. From the division of the empire arose new trajectories. The East Frankish kingdom carried forward elements of imperial tradition while adapting to regional reality. It provided the groundwork upon which later structures would be built. Identity remained fluid, shaped by language, land, and leadership. Yet within this fluidity, the outlines of a distinct path began to appear, not as a nation, but as a developing political and cultural orientation that would continue to evolve over centuries. The political structure that emerged in Central Europe during the 10th century was neither a continuation of the Carolingian Empire nor a complete departure from it. It developed slowly, shaped by memory, necessity, and negotiation. Out of the Eastern Frankish realm arose a new form of order that drew legitimacy from both sacred tradition and worldly authority. This order would later be known as the Holy Roman Empire. At its core, the empire was not defined by fixed borders or centralized administration. It was defined by relationships. Authority flowed through personal bonds, oaths, and mutual obligation. The ruler was chosen, not simply inherited, and his position depended on recognition by leading figures of the realm. Kingship required consent, and consent required balance. The imperial title added a further layer. When a king was recognized as emperor, his authority was framed as universal rather than regional. This recognition came through a close relationship with the church. The act of coronation linked political rule to divine order, presenting the emperor as protector of Christendom and guardian of moral stability. This connection elevated authority, but it also bound it. The relationship between crown and church was central to the empire's structure. Bishops and abbots were not only spiritual leaders, they were also landholders, judges, and administrators. By granting them authority, emperors gained loyal partners who lacked hereditary ambition. Church offices became tools of governance, anchoring imperial influence across diverse regions. At the same time, this arrangement blurred the line between spiritual mission and political power. The empire functioned through delegation rather than command. Territories were governed by dukes, counts, bishops, and city leaders, each exercising authority within their own domain. These rulers were not officials in a modern sense. They were partners in a shared system, bound by allegiance, but largely autonomous in practice. Law, taxation, and defense were handled locally, shaped by custom rather than uniform code. Because of this structure, the empire was inherently fragmented. It consisted of many overlapping jurisdictions, each with its own rights and traditions. No single authority controlled all aspects of life. Instead, stability was maintained through consensus and precedent. Assemblies brought together leading figures to discuss disputes and affirm decisions. These gatherings did not impose swift change. They preserved continuity. The absence of a permanent capital reinforced this pattern. Rule was mobile. The emperor traveled constantly, holding court in different regions, reinforcing loyalty through presence. Power was visible rather than abstract. This movement allowed flexibility, but it also limited reach. Authority weakened with distance and depended on cooperation to remain effective. Despite these limits, the empire endured. Its strength lay not in uniformity, but in adaptability. It allowed regional diversity while maintaining a shared framework of legitimacy. Christian belief, Roman legal memory, and Germanic custom coexisted within a single political space. This coexistence was not always harmonious, but it proved resilient. Conflict between crown and church remained an underlying tension. Both claimed moral authority, and their interests did not always align. Disputes over appointments, rights, and influence would surface repeatedly. These conflicts did not destroy the empire, but they shaped its evolution, forcing renegotiation rather than resolution. The Holy Roman Empire was not a nation-state. It did not seek to create a single people or culture. It provided a structure within which many identities could persist. Allegiance was layered, local first, imperial second. This arrangement reflected the realities of medieval life, where loyalty was personal and governance was situational. Over time, the empire became less an instrument of control and more a framework of order. It offered legitimacy, continuity, and a sense of belonging within a broader tradition. Its endurance was not the result of centralized strength, but of negotiated balance. Through its fragmented structure and sacred associations, it established a form of rule that would shape Central Europe for centuries, not by imposing unity, but by accommodating difference. Power in the medieval world did not rest in a single place. It was distributed across land, belief, and obligation, forming a structure that was flexible yet enduring. This structure is often described as feudal, though it was not a system designed in advance. It emerged gradually from custom, necessity, and the realities of limited authority. Within it, warriors and clerics came to occupy central roles, each shaping the order in different ways. Land was the foundation of this arrangement. Control over land meant access to food, labor, and protection. Those who held land granted portions of it to others in exchange for service. This service was most often military. Knights, trained for combat and bound by oath, formed the armed backbone of local authority. Their role was not only to fight, but to uphold the obligations that connected lord and vassal. Loyalty was personal, reinforced through ceremony and repeated exchange. Knighthood was not defined solely by violence. It carried expectations of conduct, ideals of honor, protection, and restraint developed alongside military function. These ideals were not always followed, but they shaped how power was justified. The knight was presented as guardian of order, defender of land and faith. His authority was visible in armor, in mounted presence, and in the ability to act decisively. Alongside this military elite stood a religious one. Monasteries and church institutions expanded across the empire, often in remote or newly settled regions. Monks withdrew from worldly life in principle, yet their influence was far-reaching. They managed land, preserved learning, and provided spiritual guidance. Their withdrawal created stability. Their presence offered continuity. Monasteries became centers of organization. They cleared fields, regulated labor, and introduced new agricultural practices. They also safeguarded written culture. In scriptoria, texts were copied and preserved. Knowledge passed through generations not by public institutions, but through disciplined repetition. Education was limited, but it endured. The relationship between knightly and monastic worlds was not oppositional. It was complementary. Warriors relied on religious legitimacy to justify their role. Clerics depended on protection to maintain their institutions. Together, they formed an elite bound by mutual recognition. Power was divided, but it was aligned. Feudal bonds extended beyond individuals to families and lineages. Inheritance became a key mechanism of continuity. Titles and obligations passed from one generation to the next. This reinforced stability, but it also entrenched hierarchy. Social mobility was limited. Birth defined expectation. Yet even within this rigidity, negotiation was constant. Obligations could be reinterpreted, alliances reshaped, loyalties redirected. The church added another layer to this complexity. Bishops and abbots often held land and exercised secular authority. They governed territories, collected dues, and administered justice. Their power derived from spiritual office, but its expression was worldly. This overlap blurred distinctions. It also provided rulers with trusted partners who lacked hereditary ambition, strengthening central influence where direct control was weak. Conflict was inevitable. Knights challenged clerical privilege. Church leaders criticized violence and excess. Reform movements arose within monasteries, calling for stricter discipline and separation from worldly affairs. These movements did not dismantle the system. They adjusted it, redefining boundaries rather than removing them. Daily life within this order was shaped by rhythm and obligation. Seasons dictated labor. Religious calendars structured time. Authority was experienced locally through lord, priest, and custom. Law was personal, enforced through relationship rather than abstraction. Stability depended less on force than on expectation. This arrangement did not produce unity, but it maintained balance. The feudal order accommodated diversity by embedding it within layered obligation. Knights and monks represented different forms of power, one physical, the other moral. Together, they sustained a system that endured not because it was efficient, but because it adapted to limitation. In this world, governance was not centralized, but it was persistent. Authority did not dominate from above. It circulated through land, belief, and service, shaping a society where power was fragmented, yet recognizable, and where order emerged through interaction rather than command. While land and lordship defined much of medieval life, another force was growing quietly alongside them. It did not depend on inheritance or military service. It developed through movement, exchange, and calculation. This force was the medieval city. Emerging at crossroads, riverbanks, and coastal harbors, cities introduced a different rhythm into a world shaped largely by agrarian obligation. Early medieval towns were modest in scale, but their function was distinct. They gathered people who were not bound primarily to land. Artisans, merchants, and traders formed communities whose livelihood depended on skill and exchange rather than harvest alone. Markets became regular events. Goods circulated more widely. Time began to be measured not only by seasons, but by contracts and schedules. Cities offered protection as well as opportunity. Walls enclosed space and privilege. Within them, residents negotiated rights that differed from those of the countryside. Legal status mattered. Citizenship granted access to trade, participation in councils, and protection under city law. Authority inside the walls was collective, exercised through councils and guilds rather than inherited rule. Trade networks expanded rapidly during this period. Rivers served as arteries connecting inland regions to distant coasts. Roads linked production centers with markets. Goods such as grain, salt, cloth, timber, and metal moved steadily across regions. With trade came specialization. Certain cities became known for particular crafts or commodities, embedding them in wider economic systems. In Northern Europe, this process took on a distinct form. Along the Baltic and North Sea coasts, merchants from different cities began to cooperate for mutual benefit. What emerged was not a state or a formal organization, but a network of interests, later known as the Hanseatic League. Its strength lay in coordination rather than command. Hanseatic cities shared commercial goals. They negotiated privileges, protected shipping routes, and organized collective responses to threat. Through treaties and mutual support, they reduced risk and increased reach. Their influence extended far beyond individual city walls. Trade routes connected Scandinavia, the Low Countries, Central Europe, and the Eastern Baltic, forming a dense web of exchange. This network reshaped economic balance. Northern cities gained leverage through access to maritime trade. Coastal ports became gateways between inland production and international markets. Wealth accumulated not through land ownership, but through circulation. Credit systems developed. Written contracts became essential. Trust was formalized through documentation rather than personal oath alone. Urban society differed sharply from rural structures. Guilds regulated crafts, training, and quality. They offered security, but also imposed limits. Competition was controlled. Innovation occurred cautiously. Social hierarchy existed, but it was based on occupation and wealth rather than lineage alone. Mobility, though restricted, was possible. Cities also became centers of culture and learning. Literacy was more common where trade required record-keeping. Schools emerged to meet practical needs. Knowledge circulated with goods. Ideas moved along the same routes as merchandise. The city fostered a mindset oriented toward calculation, negotiation, and planning. Relations between cities and surrounding territories were complex. Urban autonomy challenged feudal authority. Conflicts arose over taxation, jurisdiction, and control. Some cities secured direct allegiance to the emperor, gaining independence from local lords. Others remained subject but influential. This tension did not dissolve the broader order. It added another layer to it. The rise of trade and urban power did not replace rural life. It complemented it. Cities depended on agricultural production. Countryside relied on urban markets. Together, they formed an interdependent system. Economic growth was uneven, vulnerable to disruption, but persistent. By the later Middle Ages, cities had become indispensable. They concentrated resources, coordinated exchange, and introduced new forms of organization. The Hanseatic network demonstrated how cooperation without central authority could generate power. It was economic rather than territorial, flexible rather than fixed. This urban transformation did not create unity, but it altered balance. Power was no longer derived solely from land or faith. It flowed through routes and agreements, through ports and markets. In this quiet shift, medieval society expanded its foundations, preparing the ground for further change without abandoning its inherited structures. In the middle of the 14th century, a disruption arrived that did not announce itself through armies or decrees. It moved silently, carried along the same routes that had brought prosperity and connection. Roads, rivers, and ports that once linked markets now transmitted fear. The Black Death reached Central Europe not as an event, but as an unfolding presence that altered daily life before it was fully understood. The illness spread with alarming speed. Towns and villages alike were affected. Symptoms appeared suddenly and often ended quickly in death. Medical knowledge offered little explanation. Remedies varied from prayer to isolation, from herbal mixtures to ritual purification. None proved reliable. The scale of loss was unprecedented. In many regions, a third or more of the population disappeared within a few years. This loss reshaped society at every level. Fields were left untended. Workshops stood empty. Trade slowed as labor vanished and demand collapsed. The rhythm of life, once regulated by season and market, was interrupted by absence. Entire families disappeared. Settlements shrank or were abandoned altogether. Memory itself became fragmented, marked by gaps where continuity had once existed. The demographic collapse altered power relations. With fewer workers available, survivors gained leverage. Wages rose in some areas. Obligations weakened. Long-standing hierarchies were questioned, not through open rebellion, but through quiet renegotiation. Authority, already dispersed, struggled to respond. Custom could not easily account for a world suddenly reduced. The church, long a source of stability, faced its own crisis. Clergy were not spared by the disease. Priests and monks died in large numbers, often while caring for the sick. Parishes were left without leadership. Rituals could not always be performed. Burials were hurried, sometimes communal, sometimes improvised. The visible structures of faith faltered at the moment they were most needed. Belief itself did not vanish, but it changed in tone. Many turned more intensely toward religion, seeking meaning in suffering. Others questioned the promises of protection and order. If faith governed the world, why had it failed so completely? These questions did not produce immediate rejection. They produced uncertainty. Doubt settled alongside devotion. New forms of religious expression emerged. Some emphasized repentance and public display of piety. Others focused on personal reflection and inward faith. Movements arose that sought to bypass established authority, appealing directly to divine judgment. At the same time, suspicion and fear sought targets. Marginal groups were blamed for the catastrophe, accused of provoking divine anger or spreading illness. Violence followed in some regions, compounding loss with injustice. Institutionally, the church struggled to maintain coherence. Rapid replacement of clergy lowered educational standards. Discipline weakened. The gap between religious ideal and lived practice widened. Yet the church did not collapse. It adapted. Monasteries reorganized. New devotional practices took root. The language of faith absorbed the experience of mortality more deeply than before. The cultural response to the plague reflected this shift. Art and literature focused increasingly on death and impermanence. Time was no longer assumed to be abundant. Life was fragile, and awareness of its limits shaped expression. These themes did not promote despair alone. They also encouraged reflection on responsibility, humility, and restraint. Politically, rulers faced similar challenges. Governance depended on people who were no longer present. Tax systems weakened. Military capacity declined. In some areas, authority consolidated as weaker lineages died out. In others, fragmentation increased. The overall effect was uneven, but persistent. No structure remained untouched. The Black Death did not end medieval society. It transformed it. The crisis revealed the limits of established authority, both secular and religious. It forced adaptation rather than reform by design. Change occurred through necessity, not ideology. When the waves of disease receded, they left a world altered in proportion and perspective. Population slowly recovered, but assumptions did not return unchanged. The relationship between belief and authority had shifted. Faith endured, but it was tempered by experience. The church remained central, yet its certainty was no longer unquestioned. In this quiet recalibration, medieval Europe adjusted to loss, carrying forward a memory that would shape its understanding of order, power, and meaning for generations. The conflict that engulfed Central Europe in the early 17th century did not begin as a single, unified war. It emerged from accumulated tension, layered disagreements, and unresolved balances. Religion provided the language of division, but power gave it endurance. What followed was not a continuous battle, but a prolonged condition of instability that reshaped the land over a generation. The political structure of the Holy Roman Empire made such a conflict possible. Authority was shared among many rulers, each with rights and obligations shaped by history and compromise. Religious coexistence, established earlier as a pragmatic solution, remained fragile. Differences in belief were tolerated, but they were not reconciled. Over time, suspicion replaced accommodation. When violence broke out, it spread unevenly. Alliances formed and dissolved. What began as an internal struggle drew in external powers, each pursuing its own interests. Armies crossed borders repeatedly, not to occupy permanently, but to extract resources. Soldiers were often unpaid and undisciplined. They lived off the land, turning villages into supply points. and civilians into targets. The experience of war was rarely defined by large battles. It was shaped by movement, requisition, and fear. Troops arrived, stayed briefly, and moved on, leaving destruction behind. Fields were trampled, livestock taken, homes burned or abandoned. Famine followed where agriculture was disrupted. Disease spread where people were displaced and weakened. Population loss became severe. In some regions, entire communities vanished. The decline was not only from violence, but from hunger and illness that accompanied prolonged disruption. Children grew up amid instability, without consistent authority or protection. The continuity of daily life broke down. Religious conflict deepened the damage. Churches were seized, repurposed, or destroyed. Clergy fled or were replaced. Ritual life became fragmented. Faith, once a source of shared structure, became a marker of division. Conversion was sometimes enforced, sometimes negotiated, often temporary. Belief was shaped as much by survival as conviction. Political authority weakened further. Rulers struggled to defend their territories. Decisions were made under pressure, often reversed as alliances shifted. Loyalty was uncertain. The empire as a whole lacked the means to impose resolution. Its institutions functioned, but slowly, burdened by competing interests. Economically, the impact was long-lasting. Trade routes collapsed. Urban centers declined. Craft production halted where markets disappeared. Recovery was uneven and delayed. Some regions adapted by consolidating land and authority. Others remained fragmented, their social fabric permanently altered. The war altered perceptions of power and order. Violence was no longer seen as an exception. It became a condition. Trust eroded. Communities learned to endure rather than expect protection. Governance adapted to instability, prioritizing survival over reform. When the conflict finally ended, it did so through negotiation rather than victory. The settlement acknowledged coexistence rather than unity. Religious divisions were formalized. Political fragmentation was reinforced. The empire remained, but its center was weakened. Authority shifted further toward regional rulers. The 30 Years' War did not introduce chaos where order had existed. It revealed the limits of an already fragile system. Its legacy lay not in territorial change alone, but in demographic loss, economic disruption, and altered expectations. The land bore scars that lasted long after armies withdrew. Out of this prolonged crisis emerged a quieter landscape. Reconstruction began slowly, guided by caution rather than ambition. The memory of devastation shaped future decisions, encouraging restraint and balance. The war had exhausted the possibility of absolute resolution. What followed was not renewal through strength, but stability through acceptance of limits. When the long war ended, it did not leave behind triumph or renewal. It left exhaustion. The settlement that followed brought an end to open conflict, but it did not restore what had been lost. Instead, it confirmed a reality shaped by years of devastation. The empire remained, yet it moved into a quieter phase, defined less by ambition than by caution. The political arrangement that emerged after the peace emphasized balance over authority. Power was redistributed rather than centralized. Territories retained their rights, religions, and internal governance. The emperor remained a symbolic center, but his role was limited. Decision-making shifted toward negotiation and consensus, often slow and deliberate. Stability was valued above change. This structure produced a distinctive atmosphere. Conflict did not disappear, but it became restrained. Disputes were addressed through legal processes and diplomatic exchange rather than force. Assemblies met regularly, discussing grievances and procedures with measured pace. The language of politics favored preservation. Innovation was approached carefully, if at all. The German lands reflected this condition. They were fragmented into numerous principalities, bishoprics, and free cities, each with its own priorities. Borders were complex and often overlapping. Authority was local and layered. Allegiance was practical rather than ideological. People identified first with region and ruler, not with any broader unity. Economically, recovery was gradual. Agriculture resumed where fields had been abandoned. Towns rebuilt walls, workshops, and markets. Trade networks reconnected, though cautiously. Labor shortages altered social relations. In some areas, surviving elites consolidated land. In others, communities negotiated new terms. Growth occurred unevenly, shaped by local conditions rather than coordinated policy. Culturally, the experience of loss left a deep imprint. Public life favored restraint. Grand projects were rare. Baroque architecture and ceremonial display appeared in some courts, signaling internal strength rather than expansion. These displays were inward-facing, intended to reinforce authority at home rather than assert power abroad. Religion continued to structure daily life, but its tone had changed. Coexistence was formalized. Confessional boundaries were maintained, yet enforced conversion receded. Churches rebuilt, parishes reorganized, and ritual resumed with renewed emphasis on order. Faith remained central, but it operated within defined limits, shaped by memory of conflict. Education and administration developed quietly. Universities reopened. Legal training gained importance as governance relied increasingly on written procedure. Officials recorded decisions carefully, aware that precedent now carried weight. Authority was exercised through documentation rather than decree. This emphasis favored continuity over reform. The empire's international position reflected its internal condition. It was no longer a primary arena for continental rivalry. Neighboring powers respected its complexity and avoided direct intervention. The fragmented structure, once a weakness, became a form of insulation. No single change could shift the whole. This period has often been described as stagnant, yet stillness does not imply absence of movement. Change occurred slowly, accumulating rather than erupting. Practices hardened into habit. Institutions learned to endure by limiting their reach. The empire functioned not as a driver of transformation, but as a container for diversity. Silence, in this sense, was not emptiness. It was a deliberate pause. The memory of devastation discouraged boldness. Stability was achieved by avoiding extremes. The system rewarded patience and penalized disruption. Over time, this created a political culture oriented toward preservation. Within this environment, identities remained local. Dialects, customs, and loyalties differed from region to region. Shared structures existed, but they did not produce shared purpose. The empire provided a framework without demanding unity. It allowed difference to persist without forcing resolution. The empire of silence did not resolve the contradictions it contained. It managed them. By lowering expectations and narrowing ambitions, it reduced the likelihood of renewed catastrophe. This approach did not generate innovation, but a sustained order. In doing so, It shaped a landscape where power was quiet, change was incremental, and continuity was valued above all else. This subdued equilibrium would last for generations. Its influence lay not in what it achieved, but in what it prevented. By holding together a fragmented world through restraint, the empire created the conditions under which future shifts would emerge, slowly and without warning, from beneath a surface that appeared calm. As the quiet balance of the post-war empire endured, change did not arrive through rupture. It entered gradually, carried by ideas rather than armies. During the 18th century, a new way of thinking spread across Central Europe. It questioned inherited assumptions and proposed alternatives grounded in reason, order, and utility. This intellectual movement, later called the Enlightenment, did not oppose authority outright. Instead, it sought to reshape how authority justified itself. The fragmented structure of the empire provided fertile ground for experimentation. With no single center imposing uniform policy, rulers could adopt reforms selectively. Some embraced new ideas cautiously, others resisted them. Among the many territories, two emerged as particularly influential: Prussia and Austria. Each pursued its own version of reform, shaped by tradition, geography, and ambition. Absolutism formed the political framework within which these changes unfolded. In theory, it concentrated authority in the ruler, reducing the power of intermediaries. In practice, it aimed to make governance more predictable and efficient. The ruler was expected to act as chief administrator, responsible for justice, finance, and defense. Authority was presented not as privilege, but as duty. In Prussia, this approach emphasized discipline and organization. Administration was streamlined. Officials were trained, records standardized, and procedures clarified. The state invested in education for practical ends, preparing clerks and officers capable of managing resources effectively. Religious tolerance was encouraged where it served stability. The goal was not freedom in a modern sense, but functionality. Austria pursued reform within a more complex context. Its territories were diverse, encompassing multiple languages, cultures, and legal traditions. Centralization required negotiation rather than uniform decree. Reforms focused on rationalizing administration, reducing arbitrary privilege, and improving taxation. Education expanded, particularly in service of the state. Law became more codified, seeking consistency across regions. The Enlightenment provided language for these efforts. Reason was elevated as a guiding principle. Tradition was not discarded, but examined. Practices were evaluated by outcome rather than origin. This shift altered how rulers spoke about their role. Authority was justified through service to the common good, not solely through lineage or divine right. Religion remained important, but its position changed subtly. Churches continued to shape moral life, yet their institutional power was increasingly regulated. Monasteries were assessed for productivity. Clerical authority was subordinated to state oversight. Faith was respected, but it was integrated into administrative logic rather than standing apart from it. Education became a key instrument. Schools were established to promote literacy and practical knowledge. Universities reformed curricula to include natural science, law, and philosophy. Knowledge was valued for its application. This emphasis supported economic development, military organization, and bureaucratic efficiency. These reforms did not reach all levels of society equally. Rural life changed slowly. Custom persisted alongside innovation. Social hierarchy remained intact. Enlightenment ideals circulated primarily among officials, scholars, and urban elites. Yet their influence extended beyond their immediate audience, shaping policy and expectation. The rational state did not eliminate fragmentation. Territories retained autonomy. Laws varied. Administration differed. What changed was the style of governance. Decisions were increasingly documented, justified, and reviewed. Authority became procedural. Power was exercised through offices rather than personalities alone. This period did not produce unity. It produced capacity. States within the empire became more coherent internally, even as the empire itself remained decentralized. Competition among territories encouraged further reform. Success in administration and military organization became markers of strength. The Enlightenment and Absolutism thus operated together rather than in opposition. Ideas provided direction. Authority provided means. Reform advanced not through revolution, but through adjustment. The result was a political culture that valued order informed by reason. By the end of the 18th century, Central Europe was governed by states more capable than before. Their institutions were stronger, their administration clearer, their ambitions more defined. Yet, the broader structure remained unchanged. The empire endured as a framework of diversity, even as its components evolved internally. This quiet transformation prepared the ground for future upheaval. Rational governance increased expectations. Efficiency exposed limits. Ideas of reform, once applied cautiously, would later demand broader expression. For now, they reshaped authority from within, leaving a landscape more ordered, more deliberate, and more aware of the power of reason to justify rule. The order that had endured through caution and compromise did not disappear through gradual change. It was broken by force. At the turn of the 19th century, a new power entered Central Europe, carrying with it not only armies, but an entirely different understanding of authority. The French Revolution had already challenged inherited structures. Napoleon transformed that challenge into a continental reality. French influence reached the German lands first through warfare, then through administration. Battles were decisive, but their effects extended far beyond the field. Territories were occupied, borders redrawn, and long-standing arrangements dismantled. What had once been negotiated slowly was now imposed rapidly. The pace of change alone marked a departure from the past. Napoleon's approach to governance contrasted sharply with imperial tradition. Authority was centralized, codified, and enforced uniformly. Privilege based on lineage was replaced by legal equality, at least in principle. Law was standardized. Administration was reorganized. Titles and jurisdictions that had survived for centuries were dissolved by decree. The old order did not adapt. It was removed. For the Holy Roman Empire, this pressure proved decisive. Its strength had always lain in flexibility and balance. Faced with an external force that recognized neither, its structures could not respond effectively. Territories were reorganized into larger units, reducing fragmentation, but also eliminating autonomy. Church lands were secularized. Free cities lost independence. The patchwork of authority was flattened. The emperor, once a symbolic anchor, became marginal. His authority depended on recognition that no longer carried weight. When a new confederation of states aligned itself with French power, the remaining imperial framework became untenable. The formal end came quietly, through abdication rather than defeat. An institution that had lasted centuries ceased to exist without ceremony. Napoleon's reforms were not solely destructive. They introduced administrative clarity where ambiguity had prevailed. Legal systems became more predictable. Barriers to movement and trade were reduced. Education and bureaucracy were reshaped to serve the state efficiently. For some, these changes offered opportunity. For others, they represented foreign domination. Social effects were mixed. Traditional elites lost privilege. New officials rose through service rather than birth. Rural communities faced new taxes and conscription. Urban populations experienced both economic disruption and new freedoms. The impact varied by region, shaped by local conditions and degrees of resistance. The experience of occupation altered perception. The French presence was resented as external control, yet it exposed weaknesses in existing systems. Ideas of citizenship, national belonging, and legal equality circulated alongside resentment. People compared what had been with what now existed. Memory and expectation began to diverge. War remained constant. Campaigns passed repeatedly through the same territories, draining resources and morale. Civilian populations bore the cost. Requisitioning, forced service, and instability became routine. The promise of reform was overshadowed by the burden of conflict. When Napoleon's power eventually declined, the landscape he left behind was fundamentally altered. The old imperial structure could not be restored. Too much had been removed. Too many boundaries erased. The concept of a unified empire grounded in tradition and negotiated authority no longer matched reality. What remained was a collection of reorganized states, more centralized and administratively capable than before. They retained elements of French reform even as they rejected French rule. The experience had accelerated change beyond what gradual reform could have achieved. The end of the empire marked more than the loss of an institution. It signaled the close of a political era defined by balance, flexibility, and restraint. In its place stood a new environment shaped by law, administration, and the expectation of direct authority. The past had not been forgotten, but it no longer provided a workable model. Napoleon did not create a new order that lasted unchanged. He disrupted continuity so thoroughly that return became impossible. The German lands emerged from this period without an empire, but with altered expectations. Authority was now understood differently. Change was no longer only negotiated, it could be imposed. This rupture prepared the ground for the next phase. With the old framework gone, the question of how Central Europe would organize itself remained unanswered. Stability would be sought again, but it would have to be rebuilt on foundations that Napoleon had irrevocably transformed. When the wars finally ended, Europe did not rush forward. It paused. After years of upheaval, exhaustion shaped every decision. The aim was not innovation, but containment. Stability became the guiding principle, and memory served as warning. In this atmosphere, representatives of the major powers gathered to reorder the continent, seeking balance rather than transformation. The Congress of Vienna did not attempt to revive what had been lost in full. The Holy Roman Empire was not restored. Its disappearance was accepted as irreversible. Yet the impulse behind the Congress was restorative. It sought to limit the consequences of revolution and conquest by re-establishing familiar structures where possible. Authority was returned to ruling houses. Borders were adjusted to prevent dominance by any single power. For the German lands, the outcome was a new framework. The German Confederation replaced the former imperial structure. It was not a state, nor was it intended to become one. It was a loose association of sovereign territories, bound together for mutual security and diplomatic coordination. Its design reflected caution rather than ambition. The Confederation preserved fragmentation. Dozens of kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and free cities retained autonomy. Each governed its internal affairs independently. The Confederation provided no common executive power, no unified legal system, and no collective identity. Its Central Assembly met to discuss security and order, not to legislate change. This arrangement suited those who feared instability. Rulers regained authority over their territories without surrendering it to a higher center. The memory of revolutionary upheaval encouraged restraint. Reform was viewed with suspicion. Continuity was valued over participation. Order was prioritized above representation. Yet, the world had changed. Administrative reforms introduced during the previous period could not be undone entirely. Legal equality, bureaucratic organization, and centralized governance remained in many territories. The Restoration restored rulers, not the past. What emerged was a hybrid order, combining traditional legitimacy with modern administration. Society adjusted unevenly. Some groups welcomed the return of familiar authority. Others experienced disappointment. Expectations raised during the previous era did not vanish. Ideas of rights, citizenship, and unity persisted beneath the surface. They were not expressed openly, but they did not disappear. Economic life resumed gradually. Trade recovered as borders stabilized. Infrastructure rebuilt during earlier reforms remained in use. States focused on internal development rather than external expansion. Industry began to grow in select regions, altering social relations quietly and persistently. Cultural life reflected restraint. Public expression was monitored. Universities operated under supervision. Intellectual exchange continued, but within limits. Political debate was discouraged, not eliminated. Silence was enforced, but thought remained active. The German Confederation functioned as intended. It prevented large-scale conflict. It maintained balance among its members. It resisted rapid change. In doing so, it provided peace, but at the cost of stagnation. The structure was durable precisely because it avoided decisive action. This period reinforced regional identity. Loyalty remained local. People identified with their state rather than any broader entity. Shared language and culture did not translate into shared political purpose. Unity was deferred indefinitely. The Congress of Vienna did not settle the future. It postponed it. By restoring authority without resolving underlying tensions, it created a stable surface over unresolved questions. Order was maintained through limitation rather than inclusion. The German lands entered a new phase defined by containment. The Confederation held the space where an empire had once existed, not to replace it, but to prevent its return. Stability prevailed, but movement continued beneath the surface. This arrangement shaped the decades that followed. It delayed transformation, but it also preserved peace. By choosing restoration over innovation, the Congress of Vienna defined an era in which restraint governed politics, and change waited patiently for a moment when silence could no longer hold. Pressure rarely announces itself loudly. It accumulates in routine, in expectation, and in the distance between promise and reality. By the middle of the 19th century, the political surface of the German lands appeared calm, but beneath it, dissatisfaction had been building for years. Economic change, social transformation, and intellectual exchange had altered daily life faster than political structures could respond. Industrialization had begun to reshape cities and regions unevenly. New factories drew workers from the countryside, disrupting traditional patterns of labor and community. Urban populations grew rapidly, often without corresponding improvement in living conditions. Prices fluctuated, employment was uncertain, and old protections weakened. At the same time, a growing middle class expanded in education, wealth, and confidence. This group expected participation in governance that existing systems did not provide. Ideas circulated more freely than before. Newspapers, pamphlets, and public lectures spread concepts of constitutional government, civil rights, and representation. These ideas did not originate locally, but they resonated widely. They framed political authority as accountable rather than absolute. The restored order of the previous decades appeared increasingly disconnected from social reality. When unrest broke out, it did so almost simultaneously across multiple regions. Demonstrations formed in cities, drawing together students, workers, and professionals. Their demands varied, but they shared a common tone. Calls for freedom of expression, legal equality, and representative institutions replaced the language of preservation. Authority was questioned openly, though often without a clear plan for replacement. Rulers responded cautiously at first. Some made concessions, promising reforms and dismissing unpopular officials. Assemblies were convened. Censorship was relaxed temporarily. These measures calmed unrest briefly, but they did not resolve underlying issues. Expectations had shifted too far to be satisfied by symbolic gestures alone. A central development of this period was the attempt to create a unified constitutional framework. Representatives from across the German lands gathered to draft a national constitution. Their aim was not revolution through violence, but reform through law. They debated borders, governance, and rights with seriousness and restraint. The vision they pursued was moderate: a constitutional monarchy with a representative assembly and guaranteed civil liberties. The process was deliberate, thoughtful, and slow. This was both its strength and its weakness. While debate continued, existing authorities regained confidence. Military forces remained loyal to established rulers. Rural populations, less connected to urban political discourse, often remained cautious or indifferent. Momentum waned as coordination faltered. The offer of leadership became a decisive moment. When the proposed constitutional order sought recognition from a reigning monarch, it revealed the limits of compromise. Acceptance would have required authority to flow upward from collective agreement rather than downward from tradition. That step was not taken. The refusal was not violent, but it was final. With that decision, the initiative shifted. Governments withdrew earlier concessions. Assemblies dissolved. Demonstrations were suppressed. The movement lost coherence as hopes receded. Some participants faced punishment. Others withdrew into private life or left the region entirely. The attempt at unification ended not in dramatic collapse, but in quiet dispersal. Yet failure did not erase impact. The revolution had articulated demands that could not be forgotten. Concepts of constitutionalism, civil rights, and national unity had been expressed publicly and collectively. They entered political vocabulary permanently. Even rulers who rejected reform recognized the need to govern with greater awareness of public expectation. Social change continued, regardless of political outcome. Industrial growth accelerated. Education expanded. Communication improved. The conditions that had produced unrest did not disappear. They evolved. The Revolution of 1848 did not achieve its immediate goals. It did not unify the German lands. It did not establish a lasting constitutional order. But it altered the framework within which future change would occur. It demonstrated that unity and representation were conceivable, even if unrealized. In this sense, the revolution marked an end and a beginning. It closed the period of restoration by exposing its limits. It opened a new phase in which authority would be shaped increasingly by capacity rather than tradition alone. The dream of unity did not vanish. It receded, awaiting circumstances that would align power with possibility. The path toward unification did not follow the ideals articulated in earlier decades. It did not emerge from assemblies, declarations, or broad participation. Instead, it developed through calculation, timing, and controlled force. In the second half of the 19th century, political unity became a question not of principle, but of capacity. The conditions that had frustrated reform now enabled consolidation. Power within the German lands had shifted unevenly. Economic growth favors certain states over others. Industrialization strengthened administrative reach and military organization. Among these states, one possessed the resources, discipline, and leadership to shape outcomes decisively. Its strategy did not rely on consensus. It relied on alignment of interests through pressure and opportunity. Unification advanced through a series of conflicts that were limited in scope and precise in aim. Each confrontation addressed a specific obstacle rather than a general condition. The objective was not expansion for its own sake, but reordering relationships among states. War became an instrument of policy rather than an expression of ideology. Diplomacy framed these actions carefully. Alliances were temporary, circumstances leveraged, and opponents isolated. Conflicts were presented as necessary responses to immediate issues rather than steps toward a predetermined goal. This approach reduced resistance and limited escalation. Victory did not require annihilation. It required adjustment. Military success altered perception. States that had hesitated now reassessed their position. Participation became preferable to exclusion. The balance of power within the German lands shifted visibly. Authority gathered momentum as outcomes reinforced expectation. What had once seemed improbable became practical. Administration played a crucial role in this process. Unified command structures, efficient mobilization, and coordinated logistics demonstrated advantages of centralized control. These capacities contrasted with the slower, fragmented mechanisms elsewhere. Effectiveness justified authority. Order replaced debate. The language of unity adapted accordingly. Appeals to shared culture and history were present, but secondary. Unity was framed as security, stability, and strength. It promised predictability in a changing world. This framing resonated with populations accustomed to uncertainty and disruption. The promise of order outweighed abstract ideals. Political arrangements followed success. New institutions reflected dominance rather than compromise. Federal elements remained, but leadership was clear. Representation existed, but within defined limits. The structure balanced inclusion with control, preserving regional identity while directing authority upward. The Declaration of Unity did not dissolve difference. It reorganized it. States retained internal administration, but external policy aligned under a single framework. The new order emphasized cohesion without uniformity. It did not erase local tradition. It subordinated it. The unification process was swift compared to earlier efforts. Its speed reflected preparation rather than spontaneity. Decisions had been shaped by circumstance, but guided by intention. The result was not an idealized nation, but a functional state. This outcome altered Europe's balance. A new power entered continental politics with confidence and capacity. Its emergence reshaped alliances and expectations. The method by which it formed influenced how it would act. Authority grounded in efficiency favored decisiveness over deliberation. Yet this unity carried tension. The absence of broad participation left unresolved questions. Integration achieved through force and diplomacy required maintenance. The new structure depended on continued alignment of interest and authority. Its stability was not guaranteed by consensus, but by momentum. The road to unity had bypassed earlier visions. It replaced aspiration with execution. The German lands were unified not through shared demand, but through managed outcome. This distinction would shape the character of the state that emerged. In bringing together fragmented territories under a single framework, the process fulfilled a long-discussed possibility. But it did so on terms defined by power rather than principle. The consequences of that choice would unfold over time, influencing governance, society, and the state's relationship with its own ambitions. Unity had been achieved. How it would be sustained remained an open question, shaped by the methods that had brought it into being. The new state did not emerge into stillness. It entered a world already moving quickly, shaped by machines, markets, and competition. Political unity provided a framework, but it did not determine outcomes on its own. What followed was a period of rapid transformation, during which economic capacity, social structure, and international ambition developed in close connection. Industrialization accelerated across the empire. Regions rich in coal and iron became centers of production. Railways expanded, linking cities, factories, and ports. Transportation grew faster and more reliable. Goods moved at unprecedented speed. Industrial growth did not spread evenly, but where it took hold, it reshaped daily life. Urban populations expanded. Work rhythms changed. Traditional crafts declined as mechanized production increased. This transformation altered social relations. A large industrial workforce emerged, concentrated in cities and mining regions. Living conditions were often difficult. Housing lagged behind population growth. Employment was insecure. At the same time, a professional middle class expanded, supported by education, administration, and commerce. Social divisions sharpened as economic roles became more distinct. The state responded selectively. It invested in infrastructure and supported industrial development. It also introduced measures aimed at social stability. Welfare policies were designed not to eliminate inequality, but to manage it. These measures reflected a recognition that economic strength required social cohesion. Control and accommodation advanced together. Political life operated within defined boundaries. Representation existed, but authority remained concentrated. Institutions balanced participation with restraint. Debate occurred, but decision-making favored continuity. This structure produced stability, though it limited flexibility. Governance emphasized efficiency and order over innovation. Education played a central role in this period. Technical schools and universities expanded. Scientific research received state support. Knowledge was applied directly to industry, military organization, and administration. This integration of learning and practice enhanced competitiveness. It also reinforced a culture that valued discipline and expertise. The empire's growing capacity translated into international ambition. It sought recognition as a major power, pursuing influence through diplomacy, trade, and military expansion. Naval development signaled intention. Colonial ventures extended presence beyond Europe. These efforts were not driven by necessity alone, but by perception. Status mattered. Power was measured comparatively. This pursuit of standing altered foreign relations. Existing powers adjusted cautiously. Alliances shifted. Competition intensified. The empire's rapid rise unsettled established balances. Its confidence was grounded in economic strength and administrative efficiency. Yet expansion introduced new vulnerabilities. Commitments multiplied. Expectations rose. Within society, identity evolved. National symbols gained prominence. Shared institutions fostered common reference points. At the same time, regional traditions persisted. Unity was institutional rather than emotional. Loyalty to the state coexisted with local affiliation. This layered identity reflected the method of unification itself. Cultural life reflected complexity. Innovation flourished in science, philosophy, and art. At the same time, social tension produced debate and critique. The pace of change created uncertainty. Stability was valued, yet adaptation was necessary. Contradictions coexisted without resolution. The German Empire did not seek revolution. It sought position. Its policies aimed to secure advantage within an existing system rather than overturn it. This approach required constant calibration. Strength had to be demonstrated without provoking isolation. Growth had to be managed without destabilization. By the early 20th century, the empire stood as a major industrial and political force. Its achievements were substantial. Its institutions functioned effectively. Yet, beneath this success lay unresolved pressures. Rapid change had outpaced social adjustment. Ambition exceeded experience. The empire's trajectory reflected its origins. Unity achieved through control favored order over flexibility. Strength developed through organization rather than consensus. These characteristics supported expansion, but they also constrained response. The German Empire had reached prominence quickly. How it would navigate the demands of that position remained uncertain. Its future would depend on whether its structures could adapt as rapidly as its economy had grown. The answer to that question would soon be tested. The transition from imperial confidence to political uncertainty did not occur through gradual decline. It came through rupture. The war that began in the early 20th century placed demands on the state that exceeded its capacity to manage them. What had been built for expansion was tested by endurance. The result was not adaptation, but exhaustion. The conflict mobilized society on an unprecedented scale. Industry shifted toward military production. Labor was redirected. Resources were rationed. Daily life became regulated by necessity. Expectations of a swift outcome gave way to prolonged strain. As the war continued, economic pressure intensified. Shortages affected cities and rural areas alike. Confidence in leadership weakened as sacrifice failed to produce resolution. Military defeat did not arrive in isolation. It coincided with internal collapse. Authority eroded as institutions struggled to respond to deteriorating conditions. Public trust diminished. When the conflict ended, it did so abruptly, leaving little time for adjustment. The imperial framework dissolved without a clear successor prepared to replace it. In the aftermath, a new political form emerged. The Republic was proclaimed not as culmination, but as response. It inherited a society marked by loss, resentment, and uncertainty. The transition was rapid. Old structures were dismantled before new ones had stabilized. Authority shifted from inherited position to constitutional arrangement almost overnight. The Republic introduced principles unfamiliar to many. Universal participation, representative governance, and legal equality reshaped political life. A constitution established civil rights and parliamentary authority. These foundations were ambitious, designed to anchor stability through inclusion. They reflected lessons drawn from collapse rather than continuity. Yet the context in which these principles were applied was fragile. Economic disruption persisted. Reparations imposed external pressure. Inflation eroded savings and confidence. Employment remained unstable. The burden of adjustment fell unevenly across society. While some adapted, others experienced decline. Political culture reflected this tension. Debate flourished, but consensus was elusive. Parties represented divergent visions of order. Coalition governments formed and dissolved frequently. Decision-making was procedural, but authority appeared uncertain. Democratic mechanisms functioned, yet legitimacy remained contested. Social divisions deepened. Veterans returned to limited opportunity. Middle-class security weakened. Extremes gained attention as moderation struggled to deliver stability. The Republic offered possibility, but it also exposed vulnerability. Freedom created space for expression, including opposition to the system itself. Cultural life, however, demonstrated resilience. Art, literature, and intellectual exchange responded creatively to upheaval. Experimentation flourished. New forms of expression explored identity, trauma, and modernity. This cultural vitality contrasted with political instability, highlighting complexity rather than coherence. Institutionally, the Republic sought balance. It preserved administrative capacity while introducing accountability. Courts operated. Education expanded. Social policy addressed immediate needs where possible. These efforts achieved partial success, but they required time that circumstances did not grant easily. External conditions complicated recovery. Global economic shifts intensified domestic challenges. Financial crises undermined confidence further. The gap between constitutional promise and lived experience widened. Hope persisted, but it was unevenly distributed. The Republic's greatest challenge lay not in its principles, but in its environment. It was tasked with rebuilding trust while managing scarcity. It aimed to establish legitimacy while confronting inherited resentment. Its structures were modern, but its foundation was unstable. World war had dismantled an empire. Peace introduced a republic burdened by expectation and constraint. The transition was neither smooth nor assured. It marked a moment when possibility and fragility coexisted closely. This period demonstrated that political forms alone cannot guarantee stability. Institutions require conditions that support them. The Republic embodied an effort to redefine authority through law rather than tradition. Its fate depended on whether society could sustain that redefinition amid ongoing strain. The answer would not emerge immediately. It would unfold through pressure, response, and consequence. The war had ended. Its effects had not. The fragile balance that had defined the Republican experiment did not collapse through gradual erosion alone. It gave way under pressure that combined economic distress, political polarization, and loss of confidence in democratic authority. In this environment, a movement emerged that promised certainty, order, and renewal. Its appeal rested not on careful governance, but on simple answers to complex problems. Once in power, this movement transformed the state rapidly. Institutions were reshaped to serve a single ideology. Opposition was eliminated. Public life was reorganized around loyalty and obedience. Law became an instrument rather than a limit. The state presented itself as total, extending its reach into culture, education, and private belief. Conformity replaced plurality. Economic recovery appeared swift, driven by mobilization and rearmament. Employment increased, but at the cost of freedom and moral restraint. Society was organized for preparation rather than prosperity. Difference was defined as threat. Exclusion became policy. Violence was normalized through bureaucracy. War followed not as accident, but as consequence. Expansion was framed as necessity. Conflict escalated across Europe and beyond. Resources were consumed at a scale that exceeded recovery. As the war progressed, destruction intensified. Cities were reduced, populations displaced. Civilian life was shattered alongside military defeat. The collapse came completely. Authority dissolved. Infrastructure failed. The state that had claimed permanence disappeared abruptly. In its place stood devastation and uncertainty. This moment became known as a zero point, not because nothing remained, but because what remained could not continue unchanged. Occupation followed. External powers assumed responsibility for governance. Society confronted loss on every level. Material destruction was visible. Moral reckoning was more complex. Accountability, memory, and reconstruction unfolded unevenly. Survival took precedence over reflection, but reflection could not be avoided. Out of occupation emerged division. Two states formed on opposing principles. Each claimed legitimacy through contrast with the other. One aligned itself with market structures and parliamentary governance. The other organized around centralized control and ideological certainty. Borders hardened. Movement was restricted. Separation became routine. Daily life adapted to division. Institutions developed independently. Education, media, and economic systems diverged. Shared language and history persisted, but experience separated populations over time. Identity adjusted to circumstance. Unity became abstract. The division reached physical form through a barrier that cut through a city and symbolized separation more broadly. Its presence was ordinary and extraordinary at once. It defined movement, shaped expectation, and reinforced difference. Stability was maintained through limitation. Change returned gradually. Economic pressures, social transformation, and shifting international conditions weakened rigid structures. Communication increased, restrictions loosened. When the barrier finally fell, it did so without a single decisive act. The change was swift, but it had been prepared by accumulation. Reunification followed, bringing opportunity and strain. Systems merged unevenly. Institutions adapted. Economic integration exposed disparity. Memory required reconciliation. Unity was restored politically, but experience remained varied. Adjustment took time. In the years that followed, the state redefined itself within a broader context. Integration into international frameworks reshaped policy and identity. Economic globalization altered labor and production. Migration diversified society. Questions of belonging gained prominence. The new Germany did not return to earlier models. It operated within limits shaped by history. Authority was constrained by law. Memory informed policy. Responsibility was acknowledged publicly. These features became defining characteristics rather than burdens. Identity remained open. It was shaped by region, experience, and perspective. Unity existed without uniformity. The state functioned as a framework rather than a narrative. Continuity was maintained through institutions, not myth. This final phase did not conclude history. It marked another adjustment. The path from collapse to reconstruction, from division to integration, demonstrated capacity for change without erasure. The past remained present, not as destiny, but as reference. Germany's modern condition emerged through rupture and repair. It was formed not by uninterrupted progress, but by repeated redefinition. In this process, certainty was replaced by caution, ambition by responsibility. The result was not an endpoint, but a condition shaped by awareness of its own limits, moving forward with memory rather than promise.